Okay, I think that we are live right now. This video is going to be somewhat brief because I'm in the middle of writing a paper. Part of the reason we're doing this video is so that I can think through some of my thoughts to get this paper right. And I know a lot of you have been interested in some of the stuff that I'm studying in Jungian psychology. So I thought it might be good to show you that process and the ideas that I'm writing about. And Mercury is kind of going to help me think through it. We were going to do it anyway, but he had the idea of doing it on a broadcast as kind of a way to include the audience, since this is all about sorting ourselves out. So as much as we can, we're always going to try to involve you all in that process. I also have a bunch of questions from different comments that have accumulated over the last week or so that I'd like to address. So that's where we're going to start. This is sorting myself out. I forget to say that. And if you're new to this channel, Mercury and I are the hosts. And what we do on this channel is essentially talk about what we're working on in our personal lives. We talk philosophy, we talk personal growth and transformation. And it's really a hybrid of all these different modes of thinking and evaluating life. And we really believe in the personal vulnerability model. And that's why we have audience members on to talk to us about what they're working on. That's why we're sharing what we're working on, because we think this could turn into a community of shared transformation rather than just an isolated person talking about themselves or a constant stream of philosophy with no action. Did I cover it?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Great. So the first question was 4 days ago from Eric Gabor, who is a frequent listener and watcher of this channel. He's responding to the video I made called "It Hurts to Be a Fool, Learning from My Mistakes." And his question is, what would you do differently if you had the chance to redo it? If you rent tools you're not used to, you can't expect everything to work smoothly, especially if you're not aware of their settings and don't feel them cozy and handy. And he's responding to the video that I shared about how I screwed up the camera work last Monday. And again, this was an example of personal vulnerability. I really struggled with, I had this big filming event with this philosopher, Tim Freak, and a couple other people, and I butchered some of the footage. And I was really new to filming this sort of long form discussion. I've been very used to doing vlogs and video editing and podcasting, but not so used to entering that sphere. And so I rented one of the camcorders that morning, and I already had another one. And I essentially wasn't fully prepared, even though I had done a lot of work up to that point. Anyways, go watch that video for context. But Eric, essentially, if I had the chance to redo it, that's a tough one, because one of the problems was I was so busy that I didn't have the time and energy to fully prepare. I was already kind of overworked when I figured out that I learned about that I was going to be filming on Monday, 2 days before it happened. So I kind of scrambled to get all the equipment for that day. And that was in the midst of a lot of other things. So it was kind of a poor timing situation. But if I did have the chance to redo it, I would have asked the guys at the camera shop for advice. But I was in such a kind of a hurried state, and I thought that I needed to go do some journaling to get ready for my interview with Tim. So instead of asking the pros, they're all very highly trained with cameras, I kind of hurried off, and I should have asked them a lot of questions, and I didn't. And so that's what I would have done differently. I would have asked them some questions. And you're right, I couldn't have expected everything to work smoothly because I didn't have experience with that. So that's a really good point. Anything you would add to that, Merc?
Yeah, and in no way to discount the value of that question and of looking at the past that way. There's also the option of asking the reverse question of why did it need to work out the way it did? So like from the idea that you get the experiences you needed, more from that perspective, why did it happen the way it happened? And I find that if you ask that question in particular, I'm not saying it's the right question to ask or better, but I find the effect of asking that question is my mind produces more opportunities within the event. Like just the act of asking that question. Because yeah, it implies that there is a reason. And when you ask yourself that, you often find them. And so I noticed with yours, even bigger than learning to film the way you did, and it pushed you on that. You had the opportunity there of trying something new, failing in an emotionally painful and public way, hitting that rock bottom emotionally where you're like, fuck it, I'm going to quit school. I'm going to thinking things through, persevering and overcoming it because you got the Ken one went well. So
right.
That to me is extremely valuable. And aside from any technical thing, the ability to work with your emotional state, the ability to enter hell temporarily, not latch onto it, look for the way out and succeed. If you can create that pattern in your life of every mistake you instantly overcome like that, if you create that expectation by always looking for it, right. I think that will help you in myriad ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it definitely happened for a reason, because if I hadn't made that mistake, I wouldn't have been ready for all the filming on Wednesday. So I learned a lot from that experience. And yeah, sometimes learning from mistakes in real time rather than in practice is a real life. It's just a real life thing that's always going to happen. And it's sometimes the best way to learn, if that makes sense.
From like what you've told me privately when we weren't online, when you did tell Tim about what had happened, you said he responded very kindly. And I think
he was so nice about it when I told him I fucked up all the video footage on Monday. He was a sweetheart about it.
And that creates a sort of intimacy between the two of you that you wouldn't have had if everything had just gone well and smoothly. Yeah. Encountering difficulties with people deepens our relationships. And so you could have had a more emotionally and personally deeper connection with Tim because of having to expose yourself that way and having him react so lovingly and understandingly. Yeah. I think, that it could have given you a deeper emotional connection.
I think it did. And then we had I think it did. And we had a really good day when we were filming with Ken Wilber on Wednesday. And it really did set a different tone, having him being so forgiving. And, he was still disappointed, but he wasn't mean. He was just like, man, that's a bummer, but he was totally accepting of it. So the next question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. We'll move on to the next one.
Question from Chris M. I'm also pursuing an endeavor like yours. What was the turning point in your pursuit of Jungian psychology, clinical work, perhaps? That's a really great question, and I'll try to make that answer as succinct as possible. Really what happened was I got into Jung's work a few years ago, and then when I learned about Peterson, it really rekindled my interest in Jung. I had gone through a lot of different training programs that really gave me an adept skill set in different psychology and therapeutic formats. So I got super into Gestalt therapy, which was a model of therapy created by Fitzgerald in the 60s. And I also studied a lot with Dr. Roger Strachan, who's a psychologist, a Gestalt therapist. And I did all this different stuff that really got me into working with people. And I started working with clients a while ago, and I got a lot out of it. And I wanted to continue my development and training. And I thought the specialization in Jung's work was a great avenue to pursue. And you'll see in a few minutes here when we discuss the paper I'm working on how those ideas are sitting with me and what I'm currently working on in my studies. If that's of interest to you, then you'll get a little more information. So I've really also just doing the studies philosophically. I am an extremely voracious thinker. I like to think about ideas and how things work and where we are as a culture and where we are as individuals. And and not just from a point of view of psychology, but just from every aspect, culturally, scientifically, biologically, archetypally, all these different facets of thinking fascinate me. So that's why I'm essentially interested in Jung's perspective, because I find he has the ability to really help me look deeper into any given phenomena in a way that I'm more informed and I'm more likely to make choices in that dialogue or conversation that are going to get us further along, rather than keep us trapped in this reductionistic worldview, which I am not a very reductionistic thinker. I tend to be a very holistic thinker. So I tend to think of things as big pictures. I'm not necessarily a mechanical thinker. I know a lot of mechanical thinkers, and they're extremely brilliant people, and they're extremely detailed with one thing, right? You probably all know a lot of people that are really good at thinking about one thing. And the way my brain works is I like to abstract and get the concept and then make further abstractions based on that. And that's how I thrive. I find talking to Mercury to be similar, because I find that your mind works in a similar way. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think like for me, it's very different because I'm not goal-oriented like you are. You have more reasons for doing what you do, whereas for me, everything I've studied has more been self-understanding and trying to just manage myself. But I find I will, and I'm not very skilled the way you are at studying something in depth properly. I'm very scattershot, and I spend a lot of time just meditating on my own ideas. But I find I do sometimes sort of zoom in on one concept, work on developing my understanding of that, whether it's Peterson's ideas or Sam Harris or Alan Watts or whoever. Mm-hmm. And to sort of understand an idea, you almost have to believe it to actually understand it. And so I find you have to block off all the greater reality you know and just try to inhabit as much as possible that limited space to define it well. But then but then I reduce that sort of almost to a file or a little thumbnail after, shrink that down and try to fit it into my overall worldview.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's well put. And yeah, I think you're right. We are a little different, because the way that you came to your conclusions about philosophy and what you believe was a little different from my experience.
Yeah, but it was just for me trying to find like sanity and a way to exist in the world. Also being like a hermit and just spending a couple years totally alone, and then more years in the majority of the time alone, with like not even being able to see neighbors, really allowed me to examine my own thoughts really in depth in a way that most people just haven't had the opportunity to.
Yeah, well, solitude is pretty underrated. And if you look at a lot of thinkers throughout history, let's take Henry David Thoreau, for example, who's an extremely influential thinker. He spent a lot of time at Walden Pond. That's why he wrote the book Walden. He lived in a little cabin by himself, and he just spent that time really thinking through his thoughts on civilization and life. And he came to a lot of answers that he probably wouldn't have come to if he was in the middle of a hustle and bustle of society. Chris, did I answer your question adequately? I see that you're watching, Chris M., about Carl Jung, or is there more to that you want me to address? And now I'm going to start going to the next question. But if you have anything more, just let me know in the chat. The next question that I wanted to get to was, I hope I'm not skipping anyone, but today there was some pretty significant comments in regards to Ken Wilber's work. And first I want to just respond to Desitron said the Ken Wilber video looked and sounded good. Congrats on sorting out your filming skills. Hey, thank you so much. I feel like I did make progress on filming. I didn't get exactly what I wanted out of it, looking back, there were some things that I could have done better. For example, I didn't fully like the way that Ken's background was set up. And it's so weird when you're in the situation, because it's actually a pretty high pressure situation, because when you're the only camera guy there, and I did luckily have someone there to help me with audio, but you're trying to set all this stuff up and you can just feel the speakers waiting, like just waiting for you to tell them we're good to go. And there's this kind of edge of impatience that makes the whole thing feel rushed. And so you're rushing to get it all done, to get all the cameras in the right place and make sure the audio is working. And there were some things that I missed. And one of the things I missed was there was like this metal thing in Ken's background, and you could see the TV, which I might have been able to fix, although his background wasn't necessarily ideal to work with. So there's these things that I learned, and I also still couldn't figure out the proper focus so that I got that blurry background. I don't even know if my camera is nice enough to do that, to be honest. But anyways, I learned, I think I did a good job, and I still have a lot to improve on. So thanks, Desitron, for giving me that affirmation, and I'll keep working on it. And hopefully you'll get to see even better videos in the future. And anything you'd add to that, Mercury?
No.
Okay. So, today we posted the video about Ken Wilber, and we had some really interesting comments. One from Matthew, and then a couple from McLaurin, and then I Love Rumi, and a few other people on here that I just wanted to talk about because I thought it was fascinating. So, basically, the essence of the whole thing is, what's the point of posting Ken Wilber? I don't really understand what this guy's offering that would be worth pursuing. And Mercury, can you just kind of kick us off with an introduction to that topic to get us thinking about why we might post something like that?
Okay. And I'll say first off that I don't know Ken Wilber's stuff well at all. I've seen a few of his talks here and there, but I really like everything I've seen so far. So I have a lot to learn about him. And but I was thrilled to find out you were interviewing him. I can see that a lot of people attracted to Peterson's work might have no interest in Ken Wilber, but for people who do have, and it might just be like certain personality traits where some people have it and some don't, but some people have a longing for things like what's called enlightenment, or the deeper meditation experiences of non-duality and such. And that is just either something someone's interested in or not. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with someone who's not interested in that at all. But for anyone who is interested in that side of things, that for them will be a part of sorting themselves out. Some people just have a calling to understand that phenomenon in order to experience it. And I find everything Ken says on that interesting. Also, aside from, because this question was specifically about waking up. But aside from that, and again, I don't know his stuff well, but a lot of what I've heard him say about integral theory is very similar to my own thoughts naturally. And so he appears to have some sort of theory that values every single stage of human development. And he seems to be looking for a way, unless I'm misunderstanding, to integrate society. And one thing I really see strongly, actually, I'll connect it to Peterson. One criticism of Peterson often is you can't tell if he's a believer or not. And with the way he discusses it, both an atheist and a fundamental Christian can project their belief onto what he's saying. And some people criticize that as if it's like a cheap trick. But I see a really deep value in that. If we can find ways for Christians and atheists to understand each other better and have some at least mutual appreciation for certain things, I think that's excellent for society. And so when it comes to sorting ourselves out, I expect that there will be some insights in Ken's integral theory that allow people to help people figure out both how they should live and how to interact with other people, especially people who are very different from us.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good start for kind of digging into Ken's thinking a little bit. My dog's going crazy outside. That just drives me absolutely nuts. He's so quick. If he hears one noise in the yard, he thinks that he has to go attack it. It's really concerning. And I'm sure the neighbors love it. But anyways, I think Wilber, for those of you who don't know Ken, I'm sure it would be very easy to judge him at a first glance. But what we're looking at is perhaps one of the most brilliant thinkers of the last 50, 60 years, in my opinion. And I don't even agree with everything he says. The reason that he gets discounted is because he uses Eastern thought as one of the backbones of his philosophical presentation. And because we're a Judeo-Christian Western society that has recently evolved since the Enlightenment period to take a very rationalistic, scientific worldview, it is very easy to look at anybody who talks about meditation, states of being, or anything that's not tangible that you can evaluate as woo-woo or not worth pursuing. But if you actually look into Wilber's work, what you might find is an incredibly sophisticated thinker that not only encompasses the Judeo-Christian worldview and ethic, but also goes into Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism. So he goes on and on and on. And that is something that I think is really interesting, because a totally different perspective has evolved out of Eastern culture than Western. And if you look at it closely, what I've found, and you might disagree with this, but what I've found is Western society has really evolved in such a way that is morally defined, how to act, how to be in the world. So there's this interpersonal how to act. There's this social value system about what success is. And it's much more oriented around material progress, which I think is great. I think there's a lot of things about that that are great. And it's also more centered around the individual, as Peterson often points out, which is also great. However, what I find when I look at Eastern thought and mythology and religion, when we're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc., what I find is it's more about states of being, states of consciousness. So they have all this intricately developed information about how to reach a certain state of consciousness. And that's why we talked about waking up states, because there's growing up states, which is more of a westernized worldview, and there's waking up states, which is more of an easternized worldview. So the work that Wilber is doing is trying to integrate these different worldviews and stages and perspectives in a way that's cohesive enough, like Mercury said, that we can move forward with a more integral worldview. Did I miss anything there, Merc?
No, not at all.
So that's kind of why I'm sharing that information. I tend to get my information from multiple different places. So my educational process is pretty scattered. You know, I love Peterson. When I read his book, Maps of Meaning, it was one of the best books I've ever read. Right now, I'm reading a book called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. I'll show you right now, which is about the biology of humans at our best and worst. I'm reading spiritual texts. I'm reading Carl Jung. So I don't personally go to one field and say, okay, biology, that's where we need to get all our information. Or, okay, Sam Harris, that's where we need to get all our information. But I like to take an interdisciplinary approach to my education and to sorting myself out. That's what works for me. But the great thing about the whole point of sorting ourselves out is that it's defined by you. What do you value? Right? If we put out a video of a philosopher or a thinker or a topic that doesn't resonate with you, then just discard it. You know, take what works and leave the rest behind. Does that make sense, Merc?
Yeah, absolutely.
The other, a couple points on the chat right now. Chris M., speaking of Eastern thought, have you read The Secret of the Golden Flower? If so, what are your thoughts of that? I haven't read The Secret of the Golden Flower, but I'm fairly certain that that is what got Carl Jung into alchemy. And when he first got into alchemy, somebody sent him, a friend, I think, or someone that he was in correspondence with, sent him The Secret of the Golden Flower. And he read the text and he said, oh my God, there's so much to the world of alchemy that applies to psychology. So that's why Jung did so much work on the alchemists. I hope I'm getting that right. I'm pretty sure I am getting that right. And then Desitron says, how can you hold those paradoxes in your mind that Wilber brings up? When I cross a paradox, I have to discount it and work on the basis that it is only seeming to be a paradox that can be cashed out. That's a fascinating question. Did you understand what that question was, Mercury?
Yeah, and I would say that they're just not aware of the part of them that can contain that paradox. Underneath everything, we are this immense void of pure awareness. And different stages of consciousness are very different. And there are strange states of consciousness where the paradoxes seem perfectly natural and comprehensible, but it's really the part of your brain that is not using language that experiences that, I think, because it's not it's not a communicable understanding of paradox that I've experienced in some states, but I find you allow it to exist in that space that is bigger than your conscious awareness, and interact with it the best you can. But also, definitely, even when you're aware of a paradox, you can become aware of the value of each polarity. And each polarity has some value, is a tool, and in certain ways, when it comes to paradox, the answer you pick, rather than worrying about which is right or wrong, it's almost like it's a selection of reality. Like, imagine that when you're entering a game, like a video game, you choose certain aspects of the game, like how it's going to be. Maybe right down to coming in, whether it's cooperative or competitive, you choose the mode. And in some ways, I find when it comes to these dualities, you'll notice that each pole, if you enter that and fully believe and filter your reality to fit that pole, it's like setting reality to something different. And you'll find your entire experience different, trying to plug into each pole. And you can develop the skills to learn to step into modes of thought that are more limited than your whole perspective, but also that are the opposite polarity of what you've naturally inhabited throughout your life. I don't know if that makes any sense at all to anyone, what I said.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I think I would just add, in my own words, let me just revisit this. When I came across paradox, I had to discount it on the basis. Okay, yeah, so basically what I'm getting out of what you're saying is that you think that eventually it's not really a paradox. It just seems like a paradox. And eventually you'll find out which side of the contradiction is true and which side is false. That's an interesting point. I think that what Wilber was saying with paradoxes is, and Tim Freak was calling this paralogical thinking, where you're holding both and rather than either or. So let's take hierarchies, for example. There are hierarchies, and at the same time, we're all equal. So that would be a paradox. And the reason he says when you start getting into spirituality, you start seeing more and more paradoxes is because the more you try to transcend the body-mind, the more you're also confined by it. So you're constantly in this push-pull of, I'm this one small being in the universe and I'm connected to this vast macrocosm at all times. And so that's kind of the push and pull. And Carl Jung talked about this a lot. He calls it the tension of opposites. And it's in the tension of opposites where we get crucified as human beings. That's kind of a Western Judeo-Christian symbol, right? The tension of opposites is the crucifixion of the personal ego in the great mystery or the great tension of the universe. And so anybody who's truly living life on the Tao, on the razor's edge, is actually, in some sense, entering into that crucified state, because they have to hold these unbearable paradoxes. And that can lead to both great realizations, but also great suffering. And that's why we tend to take one side or the other. So we either really love Ken Wilber or we hate Ken Wilber. We love Jordan Peterson or we hate Jordan Peterson. We love Sam Harris or we hate Sam Harris. We have such a difficult time as human beings holding that paralogical worldview, because what it does is it makes us uncomfortable, basically. And when we're uncomfortable, we want to get out of that situation as soon as possible. Mercury and I were talking about this on the phone earlier today. How if I read something that says something bad about Jordan Peterson, I'm going to look for the first thing in that paragraph that I can discard everything they're saying, because I don't want to believe that. I have a confirmation bias. I'm not interested in believing that Jordan Peterson is a charlatan because I like Jordan Peterson. I don't want that. Did I get that right, what you were saying, Mercury?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also that if you pick up an article that is a positive of Jordan Peterson, you will just be absorbed. Like your natural instinct will fall into just like believing everything that is said, because it matches what you want to believe in. So you won't be looking for errors the way you will if you look at it the opposite way. And yeah, I found and like more recently, I learned there are studies showing all of this, but I had noticed in my own behavior and isolation that I did that. The minute I was encountering an idea that either conflicted with one of my ideas or that just disrupted my understanding of reality, without deciding to, I was immediately looking for something that allowed me to discredit the entire article or the entire video. And then later found studies that show that that's true, and that I think it was done with conservatives and liberals and being shown political articles. But they noticed that at the moment where you decide to discard that entire article because the person who wrote it is obviously shitty for whatever reason you picked out, you get a dopamine kick at that point.
Yeah.
So that behavior is rewarded by our system. And so it's nobody's fault that you do that. It's perfectly natural.
Yeah, we all do it all the time. It's an easy way to categorize it is confirmation bias. I don't know if anybody has ever bought something and then looked at all the reviews for it after they bought it to see all the great things people are saying about it. And then if you see something bad someone says about it, maybe you'll look for something even better that someone says about it to cancel it out. But these are all compensations. And that's another thing that Carl Jung talked about a lot, is the compensatory nature of the psyche. And so the reason there's this tension of opposites is because there's this compensatory nature, night and day, right and wrong. So, all these different polar opposites that create the landscape of reality. And it's actually, in some ways, it's opposition that allows us to navigate space, right? Because we look at things in the tension in the space that the opposites create. So I know that wall is over there, and I know that I'm here, and I know that there's this other furniture and all these things in between. And in the tension and in the space of all that, I start to recognize my environment, and that's why I can navigate it. And that's why Jordan Peterson doesn't like the postmodern view, because it essentially it squashes everything down to zero. And then you can't even evaluate anything in terms of opposition. And then what you have is a perspectival madness, which basically is an existential crisis where you're looking at the world from this valueless place with no hierarchical relevance. And that's why it leads to an existential crisis. So the paradoxal piece is to learn how to be in the tension of the opposites without needing to squirm one way or the other too much, and just learning how to get a little more competent in holding that tension. And so in a meditation practice or a mindfulness practice, the goal would be to notice your experience without getting attached to it, and just to see if you can build your nervous system up to the point where thoughts are arising and things are happening, but you're not reacting to them so strongly. And so you just get this more witnessed aspect of your consciousness. Chris says, I love the juxtaposition between both of you, man. You complement each other nicely. Thank you. We've thought about that a lot, and it comes right back into what we're saying about the space that opposition creates. Desitron says, that reminds me of McGilchrist's idea of multiple modes of thought, focused or expansive. Thanks for your thoughts. I need to look into Ian McGilchrist's work a little more, because I know he wrote the Master and His Emissary, and he has a lot of interesting ideas on right brain and left brain. And that, again, plays right into what we're talking about as far as the tension of opposition, even right down to the level of our biology. So, and I know that right-brained thinking is really oriented around creativity, openness, what else? Interpersonal empathy and compassion, while left brain is more linear, logistical, organized, mechanical, verbal. I know I'm missing a lot from right brain, but essentially Anthony Stevens, who wrote this book called Archetype Revisited, who studied Carl Jung a lot over his career as a psychiatrist, he thinks that what we've done is we've projected the right and the left onto the opposite side of where it should be, because in classical like Taoism, the left would be the path of openness. In other spiritual traditions, the left would be kind of the motherly path of openness and creativity and femininity, while the right would be the more masculine path of linearity, focus, and mechanical. Logos actually that's a good one, logocentric, while the other side might be more erocentric. But what's fascinating that Anthony Stevens found in his book Archetype Revisited is that the left brain is actually wired onto the right side of our body, and the right brain is wired into the left side of our body. And so he thinks that we've projected this in this kind of weird reflective mechanism, this opposition onto those archetypal fields of right and left. Does that make sense, Merck, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Aren't our eyes the one exception to that? I could be wrong, but I thought that our whole body's wired the reverse, where so my right hand is controlled by the left side, except for the eyes, that the eyes went direct. I could be wrong about that, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I need to study more neuroanatomy to figure that out. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in, I already blanked on the name you just said, the guy who wrote The Master and His Emissary.
McGilchrist, Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, all I've seen of him was his discussion with Jordan Peterson, I think. But I loved that one. I watched it twice, and definitely am interested in reading his book at some time. I just haven't gotten around to it.
Desitron says the eyes cross over too. So everything's, yeah, so it's all a crossover. And I thought that was the case, but I wasn't sure enough to confirm it. But anyways, so, Chris at M also says that sounds akin to enantiodromia. Okay, so enantiodromia is this concept that Carl Jung developed, and I know it sounds fancy, but it's pretty simple. So in Jungian psychology, there's this thing called the individuation process. And the individuation process is the individual's path towards wholeness. So your potential as a human being, Peterson talks about potential a lot. Your individuation process is about reaching the wholeness of your potential. And one of the ways that that happens is through enantiodromia, which is basically the union of opposites. So we're talking again about this tension of opposition, where you're holding this both and it's hard because it's this seeming contradiction. It's very hard to hold. And what happens is there is this symbol of self-transformation that unifies the opposites. And that's how we integrate and move forward. So I think it's called I'm slipping the name right now, the transformative principle or something like that. But there's this symbol of transformation that can unify the tension of the opposites. And it just depends on what the situation is. That the symbol might be different for each person depending on how difficult or what situation there is or their own unique personality. So basically, enantiodromia is the individuation process through the unification in the tension of opposites. It's kind of heady, but it really makes sense if you look into it. Somebody asked the question, Jason Goodwin, how do you get motivated? For me, I just get interested. I love the saying, I don't need self-discipline if I'm passionate about something. So for me, what motivates me is what I'm passionate about. You know why I didn't do well in school as a kid? And they diagnosed me with ADHD? Because I didn't give a shit about school. So I think to be motivated is to be interested and to care. And you can't necessarily make yourself care about something. Like what do you care about is a really deep question. And once we find out as human beings what we care about, then the path gets a lot more clear, because it's not so much a question of motivation at that point. It's a question of, okay, like, how am I going to get it done? And so my advice would be figure out what matters to you. And that'll get you going faster than anything else, in my experience. It's different for everyone, but that's been my experience. What's your experience been, Mercury?
I would say, like, sometimes I'm in a state where it's the same as you. Everything I'm motivated to do is out of a sense of meaning and simply doing it, and that there's a natural enthusiasm. On the other hand, in the winter when I'm depressed, and so whoever asked the question may not know, I'm bipolar, and during my depression, at certain extreme points, I can't motivate myself. So there are times where I accept that just fucking getting out of bed and eating that day is all I can handle. And I don't get sucked into thinking I will always feel that way. But for me, because of the severity of the depression I experience, sometimes I just don't have the energy to do shit. And so I just have to accept the fact that I'm not going to get anything at all done that day or that week or sometimes that month.
Yeah. And somebody said, Desitron said, it's tough when you think you care about the wrong things. Wow, that's a really good point. Yeah, there's this weird place that you could be in life where you don't even know if you even care about the things that you should care about. And so you kind of feel ashamed for even what you're interested in or what does motivate you. For example, if you're motivated by drinking alcohol, then, you know, you might have a problem on your hands if you think that there's other things you should be doing instead. So that can be very difficult. And that comes to the point of subpersonalities, because if we accept the fact that we all have many different subpersonalities, which has been verified essentially by studies of neurobiology, that each have their own motivational relevance and interests, right? So if I have a part of me that's alcoholic, then my motivation and my interest is to get drunk. If I have a part of me who's a philosopher, my interest is to discuss ideas. If I have a part of me who's an athlete, my interest is to go get on the hockey rink and play. So I would say I would be highly surprised if all of you is motivated by things that you view as damaging to yourself. And my suspicion is that certain subpersonalities can take over and start to own the territory. And when that happens, it can become very difficult to get that territory back with other parts of you that you want in the driver's seat. So one of the things that helps is negotiating. And this is something that Peterson talks about, but also a lot of other psychologists talk about this, And if you negotiate with yourself, right, giving the thing that you think you shouldn't want, if it's something okay to want, right? Like for some people, drinking is just, you can't drink at all. Like I don't even drink because I've been sober for 8 years. But there's certain things that I can negotiate about, like video games, for example. I like playing video games. So if I have a part of me that's really motivated by playing video games, then I can negotiate with that part of me if the other parts of me get to do the things that I feel from this deeper place of meaning that I need to do. So if I say to myself, okay, if you work for 4 hours, then you can play video games. I think Peterson even says in a video, get an hour of work done, you can play 15 minutes of video games. That actually really works, this sort of compromise within the psyche. You just have to decide what you're able to compromise on and where you need to have boundaries that are like, nope, I can't do any of that. And so then you have to mitigate.
And I think it's also important to identify whether it's a serious moral issue or not, that there's two categories of perhaps impulses we have or patterns we have. There's the shit like video games or even like addictions where it's not causing you to be abusive to other people, even if that's very damaging to just you, or gambling, but where it's to the point that where it's hurting you but not damaging other people. That's one category. But on the other hand, there's a category of things that you have to be strict with yourself. Like, so for instance, with me, it's suicide. When I'm depressed, like there is a part of my psyche that is suicidal. And it comes up when I'm depressed. That is one where it's a hard line drawn. And I won't cross into that one. Again, with that, though, I will even negotiate with it. And I will allow myself to fantasize about suicide and sort of experience it like just in imagination. But I won't allow myself to actually plan it. But for some people, if it's a behavior that is harmful to other people or just clearly morally wrong to you, then sometimes you do have to be strict with yourself. And it's a matter of being very aware of the hell you create if you give into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a thin line between enabling yourself and managing yourself. And yeah, that's something that we all have to discover for ourselves as individuals. And I would, like I said, I would be very surprised if no parts of you, none of the sub-personalities that make up the total of who you are were interested in other things that you feel like you'd like to be doing. My real honest guess is that if you don't feel like you're motivated, is that you just haven't given enough opportunity to the parts of you that actually are interested in other things. And that's where the negotiation starts. And the other thing is, man, we get so resentful as people, at least I know I do, when we feel like we're doing things for someone else. I feel like if I feel like I'm living in someone else's shadow, like, oh, I'm doing this because my dad wants me to, or I'm showing up to this thing for my boss. If I don't feel intrinsically connected to what I'm doing, I have this kind of existential crisis that I don't feel like I'm in meaning or purpose. And for me, it's just been essential to feel like I'm the one who's in control of why I'm doing what I'm doing.
And I would take that also, connect it to something even smaller and more practical. One thing me and my wife decided to do when we first met was, I realized that sometimes when someone asks you to do something that you don't enjoy doing, and it comes down to all the household stuff, taking out the garbage, doing the dishes, getting someone a cup of coffee. If in your mind you define that as, I don't want to do this, I'm only doing it because they expect it of me, you will gradually build up resentments. On the other hand, if you define it as like, no, I fucking want to do this.
Right.
I love my wife. It makes her happy when I do the dishes. So even though the lazy portion of me or the portion of me that particularly dislikes this task doesn't like it, the whole me wants to do it and is choosing to do it. So, because otherwise you can end up where when one fight comes up, suddenly the other person is like, unrelated shit. Like, I've been taking out the garbage. You know how often I get you a cup of coffee, and it's because they built it all up as something they didn't want to do. And that allows you to have subconscious expectations of the other person doing something in return that they're not aware they're supposed to be returning. And so it can also be hurtful for you when you're like, shit, I thought you got me coffee because you wanted to do that. I thought you helped with this because you wanted to. And suddenly you're turning it around.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. So just, if you choose to do something, define it as you want to do it. Even if you are doing it because your whole family's pressuring you, say to go into AA. If you define it as, I don't want to do this, I'm only doing it because of them, one, you won't get anything out of it. Two, you'll build up resentment. If instead you decide, I want to do this because I care about my family and the effect I have on them, then you'll get more out of it. And if you always remind yourself that you're choosing to do it, you won't get resentful towards other people about it.
Yes. So you can call that reframing. That's a term in psychology that gets thrown around. Reframing the context of your situation can be very powerful. I love that. Desitron says, I will try negotiating with myself this week then. But the part of me that wants to get drunk and play video games is very well fed and rolls over in my more aspirational self without even noticing. Well, somebody's noticing because you're bringing it up. So somebody's noticing. A part of you is aware of that happening. Maybe it's the awareness comes in when it's too late, or maybe the urge is so strong to go there when it comes up that it's just justified. Like try reasoning. Yeah, you say only after the fact. Of course, yeah, only after the fact. Well, that's because I think in part, and I'm relating to you as somebody who's a recovering alcoholic, right? Like I have alcoholism all throughout my family. It's my personal choice to be sober. My personal choice. I don't put that on anybody else. I don't think being sober is better than not being sober. I think some people are better off being sober and some people are fine not being sober. So that's my personal philosophy. But I've been sober now for about 8 years, and it's been extremely positive. And what I had to do was I had to start really feeding some of those other parts of me. And I did it through 12 steps, which really helped me, and learning how to start focusing on what I do want rather than what I don't want. And that's been one of the most important things that I've personally learned, because when I focus on what I do want, then more of that comes. But when I keep focusing on punishing myself for doing what I didn't want to do, then I seem to get more of that. So, but to answer your question even a little more, the part of you that wants to get drunk and play video games, you say, is very well fed and rolls over your more aspirational self. So when you're noticing that moment where that part of you starts to take over, what's been helpful for me, and again, for me, I don't speak for anybody else, is to notice that I'm letting this happen and that I could have made a different choice in that moment. But I don't want to make a different choice because I want what I want in that moment, and what I want is the effects of whatever I'm going after. So starting to take responsibility and framing it in a way of, I'm choosing right now to get drunk and play video games. I'm choosing. Like, make yourself cross that threshold on purpose. Do not cross it until you tell yourself, I'm making this choice, because then you're faced with this, again, very uncomfortable tension of opposites. And when you're faced with that, you have no choice but to put yourself in a precarious situation where it's akin to saying, I don't give a shit about myself. And I'm okay with that. That's kind of, you put yourself in this really difficult situation. One of the best people that I've ever worked with, when we would work together and we were working on my personal goals in my life, he would put me in these just horrible situations where he'd make me say things like, yeah, I don't give a shit. I'm choosing not to give a shit. So and it would reflect back to me the pain that was bringing up. And so it kind of expedited the process of me focusing on a different choice. So it's a spectrum though. Like for me, like I don't get to have a drink. I don't want to have a drink. And I don't negotiate with that urge. Video games, I'll negotiate with that. Other things I'll negotiate, but there's certain boundaries I don't cross for myself. Chris says, how old are you? I am 25, coming up on 26. I got sober when I was 17 years old. I started drinking when I was 12. And I got in a lot of trouble, but it was definitely an interesting time of life. Mercury, would you add anything?
Oh, for the how old are you? I don't know if they were asking that.
No.
I'm 40 or 41. I'm 40. Yeah, that's it. Also, for the issue of quitting drinking, because that's going to be a really hard thing to overcome. There's both the psychological side of it, but there's also physical addiction to deal with. And if the person can find something else that they love doing to replace it, especially if the new activity requires sobriety. So like I don't know, you're interested in arc welding and doing sculptures out of metal, and that's clearly something you can't do while drinking, great. Or just if already your pattern is to relax, is to drink because you're either alone or your friends drink, it'll be really helpful to find a new hobby that you don't associate with drinking, that you enjoy, and see if you can find some friends that don't drink, that do some kind of activity that you would enjoy getting involved in, so that it takes up more of your time. And where once you're in that situation, like say you've gone to the sporting event with a group of people that don't drink while they play sports, once you're in it, you're committed to finishing. You didn't bring alcohol with you. It's an event where no one's drinking. It'll help you get through that, I think, if you can find something like that. So do you have any passions? Do you have any passions that you haven't explored yet? Is there something you're interested in that there's a club around that you've never looked into?
Great. Yeah, and also don't be shy about 12-step programs. I know that they're a little weird, but they are really helpful, and it's basically sorting yourself out. That's all it is. It's basically everything Peterson teaches. And, first you just admit that, okay, I have a problem. You're realistic. You have some humility. The second is I need help, right? The third is I can't solve this on my own, and I believe that something greater than myself can help me solve it. The four is rigorous honesty with yourself about how you've been behaving and what your resentments are, and what you're bitter about and what your fears are. The fifth is talking to somebody about that, whether it's a counselor or a friend or a sponsor or whatever. The sixth is making a list of your character defects. What the hell is really wrong with, what are the things that have gone wrong with my personality? Where are the areas that I feel like I'm slipping up and I have these habits that are a little bit harmful or maybe very harmful? The seventh is being willing to get those defects removed from you. The eighth is you got to make a list of everybody you've harmed. The ninth is you got to go tell those people, hey man, I really fucked this up. And just so you know, if there's anything I can do to make it right, then I will. And from now on, I'm going to live a life of rigorous honesty, and I'm going to make sure to treat other people differently. That's the ninth. And the 10th is continuing to work on yourself. 10, 11, and 12. Continue to work on yourself and help others. Anybody who thinks that's a bad program, that's just funny, man. I know it's got some Christian language in it, but come on, we're more sophisticated. We can take the word out God if we don't like it. But anyways, I wouldn't be shy about checking that out. It can be extremely helpful. And we've got some more questions here, Merc, but it sounded like you were going to say something.
When you brought up the higher power level, and again, that's something where if you're an atheist or you don't like that shit, like I agree with you, just ignore it, take the rest of the program. On the other hand, if you are either a religious person or a spiritual person, or you believe in shamanism or magic or any of that, if that's something that you find naturally meaningful, I would go to that as well. If you're a person that prays, make your prayer make your prayer life around getting support from God or your angels or whatever you have. Or you can do rituals or any other practice that you feel called to or would believe in. Don't be shy to use that. If you believe in any sort of ritual stuff, do rituals to overcome your addiction. Ask for the magical help from higher powers if you have any belief in that. And if not, ignore everything I just said.
Well, there's also a neuroscience explanation for what you just said. So you don't necessarily have to be a religious or theologically or spiritually minded person to understand that. And the reason I say that is because we know that if your brain is focused in a ritualistic way, that it enhances neuroplasticity. So if you close your eyes and you do a chanting ritual or a meditation ritual, we know that this, based on brain scan evidence and further evidence, we know that this has a real effect on changing you. So any sort of practice where you get into a state of trance or a state of enlivened mindfulness is extremely helpful, especially if you're using it to focus on a goal that you have or something that you're letting go of. So it's something really to keep in mind, is even if you're not spiritually minded, these rituals, right down to the level of biology, have an effect. Desitron says, I might have to give up video games to quit drinking. The only thing that really excites me enough to draw me away from gaming is exploring ideas. Right there. That right there. Don't say the only thing, because that discounts it. When you say, oh, the only thing. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. When you say the only thing that gets me away from video games is philosophical ideas, instead of saying the only thing, saying the great thing. This is an example of Mercury's concept that he was talking about, of reframing it. Now you say, but that has taken me down some depressing rabbit holes, so I'm wary of diving into difficult ideas without a safety net. Okay, so you're in a difficult situation because you're sensitive to existential crisis. And I'm curious how much of that leads to drinking, because a lot of people will use drinking to drown out the feelings of nihilism and depression that are there for them. And so drinking helps to numb that out. So I'm curious if you can respond to tell me a little bit about if that's the case. Because my sense is that you're going to think about philosophical ideas no matter what. Definitely, you say. Okay, so we know, Mercury, that this person wants or might need to give up video games to quit drinking, is excited by philosophical ideas, but philosophical ideas also bring them into depressing rabbit holes because of their existential sensitivity. So they're in kind of a paradox. What do we do?
Okay. The word philosophy is almost like the word drugs, where we imagine it like it's one thing, but there's all kinds of different outcomes. Like different drugs take you very different places. Different philosophies also take you very different places. And if you know you're sensitive to that, it's the same way that if you know you're sensitive to a certain issue, like for people who would generally have trigger warnings, not the new definition, but someone who's experienced war and just cannot see it, they're going to be careful about what movies they see if it causes flashbacks. If you realize that you're very sensitive to certain types of philosophy, you don't need to, yes, there's always a value in facing what we're afraid to face, but there's nothing wrong with also diving into what makes us comfortable. There's nothing wrong with, if you get flashbacks from war movies, that you decide you're not interested in facing that right now, and to instead enjoy movies that aren't going to trigger that. So there are lots of philosophies that give meaning to life. There's lots of very encouraging, meaningful ways to look at the universe that you can explore. And you might want to do it by, see if you can find people where the person themselves you're comfortable with, you like them, they seem to have a philosophy that, if you feel you can interact with them and you like the way they are, and they're involved in some philosophical club. Get involved with them and find yourself some surer footing. But I think there's nothing wrong with choosing, despite all the possible reasons why existence could be horrible. And I understand those are intellectually credible. Choosing that existence is meaningful and choosing that God is good is like a reality switch again. You're picking which setting you want to live on. And there's nothing wrong with exploring the philosophies that deepen your understanding of the comforting side of religion.
Yeah. Yeah, and also your idea about having a safety net. One of the things that we want to do on Sorting Myself Out is build this community of people who care about each other. So I know that we definitely can't be people's primary safety net or whatever you want to call it, or primary resource, but I hope that we can be at least a resource for people who are interested in ideas and working on themselves and encouraging each other, that we can find a source of connection here. So again, like, just remember that that's kind of what we're trying to build. The couple more people are going to come on the show pretty soon, the podcast. I don't know why I call it a show. This makes it sound so fucking pristine. It's like a fucking low budget YouTube channel. Sorry. Oh man, I had a moment. Okay. So anyways, my point being is that, you know, definitely take refuge in this community as much as you can if you want to. We would just be so pleased by that. And people are coming on soon. We've been getting the nicest emails from people and comments from all of you about how this is helping and how they're so grateful for our vulnerability and our honesty. Somebody wrote that even a couple minutes ago. So no matter what happens, how many views we get, how many subscribers we gain or lose, like we're just here to, like, let's just do this thing right and be meaningfully connected to one another, and let's see if we can improve our lives. I mean, that's a win in my mind. Matthew Hill says, there's a reason why we play games. Our brains are wired to compete in complete challenges. There are many studies that show games grow new neurons and can help neuroplasticity later in life. Yeah, Jonathan Haidt talks about how video games are not as bad for us as people in previous generations have thought. And I know a lot of us who grew up playing video games. And Matthew, you asked me what games I like to play. I like to play a lot of games, but sports games are fun. I've been playing some Rocket League lately, and I like to play fantasy games like The Witcher, Zelda, stuff like that. I think they're just so much fun. And I love playing video games while listening to podcasts. I find that my brain retains, especially after a long day, my brain retains a lot of information while I'm playing a video game and relaxing, and it seems to be like a really stimulating and beneficial way to relax for me. So, but I don't like overdo it. You know, I found a balance in my life where it's just one of those habits that I feel like is pretty manageable for me, and it doesn't have me by the balls, so I can do it. But for you, Desitron, it is totally understandable. And there's been periods of my life where I've had to just go to take a complete break from it because I needed to be more awake and connected in other ways. And as much as video games could be helpful for some of us, I think it sounds like for Desitron, it doesn't feel like you're saying that it's being helpful right now. So everybody has their own experience.
And I would say that overall, like, I agree, video games can have a lot of advantage to someone, and that if it's not connected to any other problem, even someone spending massive amounts of time playing video games, as long as they're keeping up on their responsibilities, that it can be beneficial. The difference is with this person, they associate it with drinking. And so to quit the drinking, I would understand why they'd have to quit video games at the same time. But it sounds like they're very intellectually active. So another thing they could possibly do is find other forms of puzzles and games that you don't associate with drinking to do at home. Whether that's doing a puzzle, making a ship in a bottle, doing Sudoku, whether it's assembling models or working on math equations, like that's another form of gameplay. Find something else intellectually stimulating that occupies your time that you don't associate with drinking, And whatever it is, even if it's just making puzzles, like pictures, make sure that you never drink while doing it. And if you can just find any other activity you enjoy and you've never drank while doing it, you'll always encounter that choice. Either I'm going to drink tonight or I'm going to work on the ship on the bottle. And it gives you something else to choose other than the video games. Also, if you're really serious about it, you might want to just get the game system out of your house when you feel ready for that. If you don't want to get rid of it permanently, give it to someone you know, ask them to, you know, just put it in a box, keep it in their closet, and just remove the ability.
Yep. Yep. And it's really, again, it's very hard to, it's hard to get enough context to really help Desitron here with the, like, this would, to really get into your life and figure out exactly what's going on for you and help you to really feel grounded and prepared to take this on. It takes a lot of listening and understanding, and we're doing our best right now through this constrained medium. So obviously, you know, we recommend any resource that you have in your community that, or that you can afford, or that might be available for free, whether it's a friend or a mentor. We strongly recommend getting somebody who can give you the time and effort to really understand what's going on for you. Desitron now says, connection has been a stumbling block for me. Feeling connected, but then later deciding it wasn't genuine. You know, Mercury talks about this a lot, where when he's having an experience of profound connection or purpose, later on when he feels depressed, he'll think it's entirely stupid. And I've experienced that as well. My mood really changes the way I think about things. Like right now, I think this live stream is great. And in 20 minutes, I might think it was the worst thing I ever did. So there's this way in which our moods kind of color our perspective. You also now say not having a model for what is actually connecting and how that actually happens. Well, one thing you can do if you need a model is look up. One of the things you can do if you need a model for what connection is and how connection happens is you can go philosophical on that end. You can look up the new series on YouTube by Vervaeke. I think Dr. John Vervaeke, he calls it Awakening in the Meaning Crisis. And he's a cognitive science expert. And he talks about, you know, actually what is happening when we're feeling purpose and connection. And he gets into extreme detail about that. So if you need that model to help you connect and see what that is, and that's one option for you. There's a lot of resources. Again, though, philosophy is only going to go so far with connection because it's not really about thinking at a certain point. It's about feeling when we're coming into connection.
I would also say, what about the other form of connection? Do you have a sense of connection with other people in your life? Do you have close relationships, and are you skilled at connecting with another person?
Yeah. That's a good question. If you want to answer that, go ahead and answer that. You also say, Desitron, that you've been watching Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis series and you're pursuing those ideas now. Fantastic. And then you say you do have connection, to answer Mercury's question, on a superficial level. So it sounds like you don't feel that there is the depth that you would like available to you in your life. And really, one of the things about drinking is it does a lot of our self-medicating habits as human beings come from a lack of connection, a lack of community, a lack of feeling that sense of belonging and feeling that sense of purpose. And if you watched Nolan's conversation with us a couple weeks ago on this channel, you'll notice that one of the things that he really wanted was to contribute something, to feel purpose. And then if you watch what we posted where Gary Lester talks about how everybody wants to give and nobody wants to receive. But there's this sense that feeling like we're contributing something is extremely valuable in this process of finding meaning and purpose.
So a couple things that, not specific to who we're talking to, but just in general, that I find, like, a few things that block that sense of connection with other people. So just as general advice, one, I would say that this is, again, one of the areas where taking a sacred vow of honesty pays off. When I first got together with my wife, and because it involved her moving to be with me if it was going to work out, I went the opposite route of what many people do, where you try to show your best self. And I instead told her everything about me that I thought could be a problem. So we didn't start working on a relationship that couldn't work out. And I forced myself to be honest with her. And I realized that in our relationships with people, when we lie, we are not presenting our true self, and therefore we cannot feel a proper connection with them, because we're constantly, even if it's subconsciously, aware that if they love me, they only love me, this lie version of me. And so if you can be fully honest with somebody, you'll feel a deeper sense of connection. Also, only showing people our best side doesn't allow us to connect deeply. A lot of our deep connections with people are people we've been through hard things with, people that we know the ugly side of them or the most painful things that have happened to them. And sharing the parts of you might be embarrassed of with people, or creates a deeper connection. Also, the idea of what do you do with your friends? If all the time you spend with your friends is shallow drinking and playing video games, it will feel shallow. On the other hand, if you find philosophy meaningful and you develop some close friends where that's your common activity, is doing something you both find meaningful, you will feel closer to that person than you'll feel with somebody that you only do superficial activities.
That's a great point. I feel like we're throwing a lot at this person. But not that in a bad way, in a good way, but I'm just cognizant of people can only retain so much processing within one time period. Oh, here we go. We got another. I think everything you said was great, by the way. I was just thinking maybe we're overloading information, possibly. But let us know, Desitron, if that you still want more. Oh, thanks. So it helps. Okay, so I'll take it that you're not feeling overloaded too much, because you can also go back and listen to the recording anytime if you feel like you want to revisit some of the things we discussed. Henrik says, I'm introverted and I'm thinking about trying dance lessons in a desperate attempt to overcome my social anxiety, but I'm also realized and self-aware that it isn't likely to happen. Help. Okay, go for it, Merk.
I was going to say, give yourself a reward if that's possible. Is there something you like to do, but you can't afford to do it on a regular basis that you could this one time afford? Is there some treat? Is there some activity that's not harmful to you, but like whether it comes down to, if you're dieting and you do allow yourself a weekly cheat night or something, if this means a lot to you and you can motivate yourself, give yourself some kind of reward if you follow through on it.
The dance lessons, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't sure if you were talking to the same person.
Yeah. Like I found with, like, so for example, to give something like personally that I did recently, taking over this channel was the same. I'm very introverted, took a huge amount of effort to step into it this way. A part of me really didn't want to do it, but the larger part did, and I decided to. I was really lucky. I had a little bit of spare money at the time, and I enjoy collecting vintage toys. I can't buy them often. And I told myself that if I followed through with the channel, I'd let myself do some toy shopping, and I treated myself to a few things. And that really did help motivate me, as stupid as it sounds, but it appealed to my inner child and it helped motivate me, where I said, okay, I'm going to follow through on this. And because I did, I can go order some fucking toys and treat myself. But I found it effective, as stupid as it sounds.
I just want to go over something with you all to address this question as well. It's called Singinger's Learning Zone Model. And I'm just pulling up the zones here so that I can share the screen. Let's see if it will work. I'm going to blow it up in the screen here. All right, so we've got it. And I'm going to share the screen. Give me just a second to figure out how to do that. Okay, perfect.
While you're figuring that out, I'll also just say you can also break the task into smaller pieces. So instead of just jumping into, I need to go to this dance lesson, take it in steps. Say, okay, I'm not going to commit to going yet, but I'm going to look up where the dance class that I want to take is, just so I know where it is.
Right.
The follow-up step could be, I'm going to set aside the money for it, just in case I intend to do it. And then actually take the money physically out of your bank and set it aside in a book or somewhere for when you're ready. And if you take small steps building up to it, maybe the step after would be to find someone else that wants to go with you and to say to them at first, I'm not even committing to going, but I'm thinking about going. If I did, would you like to go? And if you keep building up like that, you might eventually find yourself at the class and enjoying it.
Yeah, that's actually a great tie-in to what I'm about to share. Forgive me because the graphic here isn't as big as I'd like it to be. But essentially, if you can look at your screen, if not, it's fine. If you're just listening, that's fine. But there's 3 circles. There's the middle circle is the comfort zone. The yellow is the stretch zone, actually also known as the learning zone. I like the learning zone just as much. And the third is the panic zone. So the way that this model works, it's a pretty simple model. It was developed, I think, early 2000s, late 90s. And the way that this model works is essentially if you're in the comfort zone, where you're on challenge, bored, stable, safe, it's easy, it's comfortable, it's secure, you're not going to grow. So there'll be no growth, no learning. Okay. If you're in the panic zone, all the way to that third layer where you're very stressed, if you're having a panic attack, if you're feeling super anxious, annoyed, frustrated, exhausted, you're pushing yourself too hard, the likelihood of you growing and improving on a certain area is very, very low because you're going to snap right back into the comfort zone because you're like, why the hell would I want to do that? So the primary area that you want to engage in, and this is akin to Peterson's concept of being mindful or meaningfully engaged, is the learning zone. You're not comfortable, but you're not panicking. You're focused and relaxed at the same time. You have a sense of timelessness. You're in a flow state essentially where you feel like you're just facing enough challenge that you're pushing to some of the edges of your abilities. So if you go to the dance class and you feel like you're in the parking lot and you feel like you're going to have a panic attack, maybe you went too far that day, right? Maybe there's this, like Mercury saying, maybe there are steps that could build up to stretch you so that your capacity to do it incrementally improves. The biggest mistake that can be made is trying to do it all at once or not trying at all. And the same thing goes for anytime we try to go to the gym, or exercise is a really good example. Okay, so if you go to the gym and you start lifting weights and you just go balls to the walls, you just try to push as much as you can, stay in there as long as you can, sweat as hard as you can, you get the cardio, you get the lifting, you've got it all going on. The burnout is going to be so quick. You're not even going to be able to move the next day. So the likelihood of you getting back to the gym that week is really, really low. You'd be much better off doing a 75% workout. And there was a guy on Joe Rogan's podcast who confirmed all this, who's a martial artist that had some interesting things to say, but I'm just tying these things together for you. That essentially the best place to be is in that 75% zone where you're not comfortable, but you're not like dizzy. You're not working so hard that your body is getting dizzy and you feel like you're going to pass out and you can't do anything the next day. So how to find that place in life where we're right in the Goldilocks zone, the not too hot, not too cold, but just right. That's kind of the key, I think, with some of these questions.
Also, I think that, and like with the working out example you use, that what you said is great. But some people will need to be even more delicate with themselves if you have a particular anxiety or if you have really strong depression. And so for me, because I do manage to get a lot of exercise usually in the summer now. In the winter, not at all. Once I get depressed, I just can't do it. But one thing I find is that if I'm trying to get myself back into working out, and I just can't do it yet. Like an actual workout is too much. What I will do instead is tell myself, okay, I'm going to develop the habit of starting to work out without worrying about finishing. And so I'll pick something so easy that I don't mind doing it, like just 3 push-ups. And I'll just try to establish the routine of doing 3 push-ups a day, because I know if I push myself to do a real workout, I'll feel too worn out, or just I'm too miserable to do it. And by establishing that pattern first, I then find it easier to like extend it, where I'm like used to doing 3 a day. Fuck it, I'll do 5. Then fuck it, I'll do 10. And then one day you're just like, fuck it, all right, I'll work out for half an hour. Mm-hmm. So the example of going to the dance class, for instance, another thing you could do, as stupid as this might sound to some people, is pick the exact dance school and decide that for the next couple weeks, you're going to go to the dance school, but not go in once a week. Like, say your idea is to take the dance class on Thursdays. Create the habit of just going to the front door every Thursday. And at first, don't force yourself to go in, but just create that habit and realize that you can at least handle the trip to the door if you're not worried about forcing yourself to stay. And you might find that without even forcing yourself, and you could start with, I'm going to go, but to make sure I don't push myself to go in, I'm not going to take the money. The next step could be, well, I went twice. I'm going to show up this time, and I'm going to have the money with me, but I'm not going to go. And you might find that just suddenly one day you're there at the door and you do go in.
Yeah, Henrik also shared, I live in the panic zone. And Rob is here, who you talked to Rob a couple weeks ago. Yeah, and he says social anxiety can be overcome just by step, just like you outlined, dancing with other people. I overcame serious social anxiety by making steps like that. And one day sharing really helped it too. And it disappeared. So that's awesome, man. If you feel like sharing more, then go ahead and write more. Dust to Dust says,
if Rob wants, maybe we should have him on sometime where the entire point is for him to explain that, where we just stick to that one topic and he can really share with the audience in depth.
That'd be fantastic. You're free to come on anytime you want. So,
yeah, so if you're interested in that, Rob, let us know.
Dust to Dust says, I like the push-up suggestion. I used to do 10 every day, but if I knocked it back to 3, I would have no real excuse. Okay. Yeah, well, the thing about this is everybody needs to find their own learning zone. That's the point. My 70% is different than your 70%. My 50% is different than your 50%. So whatever percent you can give without going into panic, that's the percent to work with. If that's 5 push-ups, then it's 5 push-ups. If you can give 20 push-ups, then do 20. If you can do 100, then do 100. But whatever your capacity is. Now, for Henrik, feeling like you're living in the panic zone, I have some very close friends who are this way, and it's extremely difficult because just getting out of bed can be enough to produce a panic attack. So that is a situation, whether it's dealing with the classical diagnosis of agoraphobia or whatever it may be, that's the kind of situation that's just, my heart goes out to you, because it's just such a scary thing to feel your nervous system so jacked up all the time. And honestly, scientifically speaking, there's a lot going on in your nervous system and biologically speaking that contributes to your sympathetic nervous system basically jacking up your heart rate and screwing up your breathing and dysregulating your limbic system and your emotions that makes it very difficult to even get started, because if you go into fight or flight before you even have a chance to address the situation, then it's just a tough place to start. So there's got to be a way to interrupt that process mindfully so that you're starting with at least some safety. Because if you start from, I'm already not safe before I even leave the door of my house, That's just a difficult, it's a difficult place to be. So establishing safety where you are right here and now can be something to start exploring. But these are issues that people spend a very long times dealing with. So also be realistic about what you need. And, you know, obviously nothing that I say on this platform is probably, I'm sure you've heard it all before. So my experience with people who deal with these things is that they know what they need to do. They just don't know how to do it. Chris M, phone is dying. I appreciate the dialogue. I'd be interested in coming on the podcast. Okay, if you want to come on and shoot the shit with us, then email sortingmyselfout0@gmail.com. Sortingmyselfout0@gmail.com. And you can go ahead and email us and say you want to come on. And as long as you're willing to kind of talk about what you're working on, and not as only as vulnerable as you want to be, but just loosely talk about yourself in that way. That's kind of what we ask of you, and we'd love to talk to you and get to know who you are and what your ideas about life are. So now we're looking at basically the three people, or the main people that really were vulnerable today are Desitron. Oh, by the way, Desitron said they were tearing up a little bit, to be honest, is what they said. And I said, we're here for you. Dust to Dust says that they're learning piano and they find it rewarding because awesome. there's a reward in learning the songs. That's fantastic. So.
And I would also like to encourage, like one of the ideas we had taking this over was, like we discussed on Ryan's channel once, the idea we'd been just using a working title of the amateur dark web, in that there's the intellectual dark web right now where serious thinkers are getting together, trying to talk in good faith and honesty to try to steer society in a better direction. We liked the idea of creating an amateur league for it where people can talk to each other, where just everyday people can start engaging in the same activity of discussing our personal lives and taking it down to the individual level. So I like the idea of on this channel, us having conversations with people, but also if anyone listening to this has some feedback or wants to connect to any of the individual people who commented today, I encourage you to talk to each other in the comments. And
yes.
There's far more people out there going through the same things than most people realize. Also, I like that the channel, we've managed to have a little bit with Tim and Ken so far, and it would be great if this channel could in a way be a bridge between the intellectual dark web and the amateur dark web, where we could have people from both groups on. But to create more of a sense of activity, community, and very inclusive of just everyone themselves defining their own good and trying to be as cooperative in an integral way as possible, where whatever it is someone's working on, whoever resonates with that supports it. But where we're not discriminating between people who are taking certain paths. That if you're Christian, great, let's work on being a great Christian. If you're an atheist, great, let's work on being a great atheist.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a great intention that we can all hold together. Any last minute questions? I was going to talk about what I was going to write my paper on, but I've already spent more time than I can afford doing this. So we're not going to go down that road. But does anybody have anything to say before we end this process, this live stream? And if so, speak as soon as possible before we end this. And Rob also did respond and say that he would be more than happy to come on and talk about that. So that's good.
Awesome.
And Dust to Dust said they like the push-up suggestion. Oh, maybe I already read that one. Used to do 10 every day, but if I knocked it back to 3, I'd have no. Yeah, I think I did read that one. Dust to Dust says, thank you for the advice. You're welcome. Take everything with a grain of salt because universalism doesn't work. It's hard to give universal advice to unique individuals. So take what works for you and leave the rest behind. That's my advice. Everybody has a different experience, and everybody's psychology works a little differently, and we're all dealing with unique life circumstances. And so do your best to take what applies to you. And just if it doesn't apply to you, if it doesn't feel right, then please discard it. One of the things that can be very damaging about advice is people take the advice on sometimes, even when it's not true for them. So my process with that, I used to, when somebody gave me a piece of advice, I used to take it really seriously. And sometimes I would take it really seriously, even if it didn't feel intuitively right to me. And so what I learned along the way is that when it comes to taking advice, it's super important to use your own inner barometer to see if it feels right. And you'll know if it feels right because it'll be so obvious. It'll feel like, oh my God, yeah, that's exactly what's going on, or that's exactly what I need to do. You won't feel like this huge level of contempt and resistance to it unless there's a significant defense against working on it. But if there was such a significant defense about working on it, you wouldn't be asking for advice in the first place. So those are some things to keep in mind. Henrik says, this is nice and intimate. Honesty is crucial in this type of dialogue, and the fact that we are few is a strength. That's great. I agree. Dustida says, yep, and Desertron says, look forward to the next live stream. Thank you. Anything else from you, Mercury, before we end?
No, I'm good.
All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon. I'm going to get down to work here, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are and when it is. McLaurin, you missed the live stream. Go ahead and watch it. I think it'll be worth it if you have the time. Okay, everyone. See you later.